So we're now going to move into the characteristics of the fibers themselves and what's referred to as motor units. Motor units is the motor neuron and all fibers that it innervates. And so what we're looking at here is a single motor unit. The motor unit has a functional end to it. The functional end of the motor unit is referred to as the motor end plate or the neuromuscular junction. The motor end plate and neuromuscular junction is the interaction point between the motor neuron and the skeletal muscle itself that allows for the depolarization of the skeletal muscle to allow for the action potential to be propagated through the skeletal muscle to allow for contraction to take place. What the motor end plate, neuromuscular junction, and the properties of the sarcolemma and transverse tubules do is that it ensures that the entirety of the fascicle will contract as a single unit instead of having piecemeal contractions. So we talked about the sarcomere being the functional unit, the contractional unit within the skeletal muscle. We don't have one sarcomere contracting all by itself. If a single sarcomere is contracting, all of the other sarcomeres around it are also contracting. The contraction pattern that comes out is described as either being concentric, shortening, eccentric, lengthening, or isometric, no motion whatsoever. The way in which these fibers are recruited, the way in which the motor unit functions is based off of the type of muscle fibers being recruited. The way in which we discuss these fibers is typically by nomenclatures of Roman numerals, in which we have a type 1 fiber and a type 2 fiber. Now, even though we talk about them as being type 1 and type 2, there's actually a continuum of fiber types. There is 27 subunits within these nomenclatures, references being A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. In the type 2 fibers, there are two subtypes that you need to be aware of. There's the type A subtype, and there's the type X subtype. Now, your book will mistakenly reference these type X fibers as type 2Bs. We do have type 2B fibers. However, the type 2B that the book is referencing, we find only in rodents. We don't find in humans. The type 2Bs that we have act kind of in between a type 2A and a type 2X. Within these various fiber types, we can categorize them based off of what's referred to as twitch characteristics, in which we have slow twitch and fast twitch. The twitch is the indication of how quickly does troponin get out of the way and how quickly can myosin do its conformational change within the contraction stroke. Now, what's interesting is that the slow and the fast will be recruited at the same time within the muscle. The slow twitch is slow to the point where when the fast twitch gets recruited, the slow twitch and the fast twitch will do their contraction at the same time. But the fast is so much faster than the slow that we can't differentiate fast from fast, but we can differentiate fast from slow. Now, your book will tell you there's a medium or an intermediate twitch. The problem is that anything that is not the slowest of the slow or the fastest of the fast, because we're dealing with a continuum, is automatically intermediate. Metabolically, we have oxidative fibers and we have glycolytic fibers. The oxidative fibers we reference as being SOGs, slow oxidative and glycolytic. Those are predominantly within the type 1 continuum. And then we have fast, and we have two branches of fast. We have fast oxidative glycolytic. These tend to be slower, fast twitch fibers. And then we have fast glycolytic, and the fast glycolytic are the fastest of the fast. The oxidative component within this is an indication of how they go about getting ATP back in order to allow for contraction to continue. Now, the way in which we can differentiate between muscle fiber types is based off of myosin staining principles, in which we use pigmentation to stain specific types of myosin. And so what we see is that the type 2 fibers typically stain dark, and the type 1 fibers typically stain light. And so within the muscle plug that we see here, notice how we have different sizes of muscle fibers. Each one of those muscle fibers is indicated as either being a type 2 or a type 1. Notice the proportionality between type 1 and type 2. For most individuals, you have about 2/3 type 1 and about 1/3 type 2. Now, based on cross-sectional area of the muscle, as you train, you can change the proportionality of the fibers. However, you do not change fiber types. So let's talk about classifications here. And when we talk about twitch classifications, we're talking about how the myosin chain is going to move. Fast twitch have a fast myosin chain, which is going to perform a very rapid contraction, whereas slow is going to perform a slower myosin contraction. This contraction is going to lead to the cross bridges rapidly moving or not as rapidly moving, and rapidly dissociating or not as rapidly dissociating with the binding sites on the actin. Fast muscles need a large amount of stimulus and a large amount of calcium to allow for those binding sites to become active, relative to the slow twitch. The oxidative characteristic of the fiber is how do we utilize the metabolic pathways in order to get ATP back to homeostatic concentrations to allow for the contractions to continue. The problem with this is that if I want to be oxidative, I need to have more ATP available to me. If I have more mitochondria available, that takes up space within the myonuclear domain that would be available for the protein arrangements. So we typically have smaller fascicles and smaller fibers on the oxidative side, like we just saw, than we see in the glycolytic side. I've given you a table that lists out various characteristics of the fiber types, and so we're going to walk through the fiber types here, looking at characteristics of each. So the type 1s are the oxidative muscle fibers. These have a high concentration of myoglobin, a high concentration of mitochondria, and are very capillary dense. The myoglobin is what gives the muscle its red color. If you eat red meat, the redness that you see in the muscle is myoglobin. The redness that comes out of the red meat is not blood, it's myoglobin. In terms of recruitment, this has the highest percent of fiber recruitment during any activity, simply because it's the easiest to recruit. These have the least amount of power, but perform the greatest amount of work. That means that they have the longest twitch length. And by length, I'm talking about time. They are slow in their twitch characteristic. And the reason why they're slow in the twitch characteristic is because they're reliant upon oxidative ATP return, which has a lower rate of return. The type 2 fibers are referred to as fast twitch. These are lower percent of fibers being recruited during any activity. Based on the difficulty of the activity, we will increase the percentage of fibers being recruited. One of the reasons why we have a lower percent recruited is that it requires more stimulus in order to be recruited, in which we have a continuum where we recruit from the smallest of the type 2s to the medium of the type 2s to the large of the type 2s in a pattern known as Henneman's size principle. The first of the subsets of the type 2s that you should be able to recognize are the 2As. These are moderate fibers in terms of power and work. We are typically using these type 2s in power activities that have some sort of prolonged nature of contraction within it. They will exhaust themselves in 2 to 5 minutes if they do not have constant perfusion through them. They have a moderate amount of myoglobin and a moderate amount of mitochondria within the fibers themselves. They have a higher vascular density within the connective tissue than the 2Xs to allow for the constant perfusion to the tissue. The 2Xs are the fastest of the fast. They have the highest amount of power output out of all of the fibers. They have the greatest amount of strength capacity out of all of the fibers. However, they have the lowest work performance. They fatigue very quickly. The mitochondria they have is strictly around the sarcolemma and predominantly near the neuromuscular junction to allow for repolarization, to allow for rapid re-recruitment of the muscle, to allow for tectonic contraction to take place. In terms of the strength ability and the fatigue ability, we have a continuum. And this generalized continuum is based off of the principles of the size principle, where if I need low levels of mechanical force or strength, I will be recruiting things that do not fatigue. However, if I need high levels of mechanical strength, I'm going to recruit larger fibers, those fibers that have a high level of fatigability. This goes hand in hand with how easy or how hard it is for me to recruit those fibers. We'll talk about this recruitment patterning and this continuums when we look at adaptations based off of the principle of overload, either due to constant tension or need to overcome external forces.